Welcome back to Indyfest 2021, our final event of the day. I'm Jon Ralston, the editor of Nevada Independent. Thanks to all of you for sticking around. Tomorrow, of course, we have a full slate of activities with Mark Mellman, the pollster, as well as the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and a panel on online gaming and its future with the head of MGM Resorts, Bill Hornbuckle, and the head of the American Gaming Association, Bill Miller. But I'm really excited for this final panel of the day, for someone I've always wanted to have a longer conversation with. Please welcome everybody, Nate Silver, a world-renowned data expert. His 538 blog was groundbreaking. He's worked for major media organizations, ESPN, New York Times, and ABC. Nate, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Definitely happy to be here.
Great. But before we get started chatting with Nate, I want to thank Alex DeCastroverde and his law firm for sponsoring this panel. And I want to remind everybody out there, the chat is up. If you have questions for Nate, put them in the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we can in 45 minutes or so. So, Nate, you've talked about a lot of subjects over the years, including some near and dear to my heart: politics, polling, journalism, all kinds of stuff. I want to talk. Maybe we'll talk a little sports at the end too, if that's all right with you.
Of course.
Did you predict Michigan was going to crush Wisconsin today?
I mean, my parents live in Ann Arbor now, so
they do.
Know. Yeah.
Oh, Ann Arbor is a great town. I'm a big Michigan fan, and that game actually surprised me. But maybe we'll talk some sports later. Let's talk about polling. Is polling broken?
I think the short answer is no. The long answer is polling has a lot of problems, and the question is kind of what you compare it to. I mean, my view has always been that, like, I kind of got into politics by looking at polls in part because, number one, I thought the kind of standard takes you get from talking heads are not very useful at all and are often quite biased, right?
I'm a former talking head, and I'm
terribly
offended by that.
But you're more rigorous, right? You're more rigorous, and like, even though, I mean, I believe in rigor is kind of what I believe in, right? And one way to achieve that is through polls, but not the only way. They're cheap and dirty polls that aren't very good. So the question is kind of what does it compare to, and what are the alternatives? But the longer answer is that clearly it's a problem when the notion that you can like randomly dial someone at their house, right, and say, "Can I please speak with the person with the next birthday?" And if that's the woman of the household, right, and then and then they respond, and then you kind of get a perfectly representative sample of the electorate. That's been BS for a long time. Most people who don't respond to polls, the people who do are kind of by definition somewhat unusual. You can try to do demographic weighting to account for some of that, but it's hard. Someone who's less trusting of government or less trusting of institutions may be less inclined to take a poll. Can you adjust for that? Maybe, maybe not. At the same time, it's worth keeping in mind, it's not always the case that the polls miss low on Republicans. We just had a California gubernatorial recall where a month out, the polls showed a race that was almost tied.
Right.
You wind up having no winning by 24 points, right? Nevada's a state where you've seen polling misses in both directions. We probably remember 2010, for example, right?
You brought that up before I did.
I know, yeah. Preemption.
That's our first conversation via email when I told you that Reed was going to win.
I mean, look, I think you're special, though. You're in a special category of people who can probably outpredict the polls. I think most people probably do not. And I guess my point is, like, it's one thing to say that, like, there is more uncertainty than the polls let on, which I very much believe in and agree with, and that's why we put probability estimates out at 538. It's not to say that my gut instinct is better than the polls. I think, if anything, people should weight against their gut instinct when it comes to politics, because people are number one, people are very passionate about political outcomes, so they want to kind of see what they want to happen, right? So there's confirmation bias. Number two, the thing the Republican panel were saying about media elites being in a bubble is 100% true. Media is becoming more and more a field where it is controlled by people who kind of went to elite colleges and who live in dense urban bubbles and who live with certain types of people, and they don't necessarily have a good instinct for what the average person thinks. And so it's very important to do polling to actually see what the average voter actually thinks like. Unfortunately, polling is hard to do right now, but it's an important tool for democracy.
When you say, unfortunately, polling is hard to do right now, why?
Again, it comes back to the fact that people mostly don't want to respond to polls. At least not by, first of all, you can't even call landlines anymore because most people use their cell phones, right? You can kind of overcome that. It's a bit more expensive to do cell phone polling. You have problems where, I have lived in New York for 12 years, right? I still have my phone number from Chicago, from where I went to school, and first got my first cell phone at age 19 or whatever, right? And pollsters have some ways to overcome that with registered voter list, for example, but it's not perfect. You can also try to reach people online. The problem with online is that there's not a way to get a truly random sample, right? You can't randomly ping me on the internet and say, hey, can you take a poll? And then somebody could literally randomly call me at home or literally randomly knock on my door and kind of interrupt what I'm doing. It was always kind of rude in some sense in the first place, right? But so you have to recruit panels and try to make them representative, which some firms are pretty good at doing. Obviously kind of online polling is going to have to be the future, but there's no kind of pure approach to polling that really works anymore.
You got a lot of attention when 538 first came out and did a lot of political stuff in 2008 and 2012. You essentially called the race almost, I think, 50 out of 50 one year, then 48 out of 50 the next cycle, if I remember correctly. I think, you may be very, very good at what you do, and you are, but you didn't have a crystal ball. You did it through data, and I think people in my business, what? How is he doing this? How did you do it?
You're trying to find, again, it comes back to kind of rigor, right? And again, our goal is not to actually make predictions. It's to set good betting lines, in essence, is the Nevada way to put it, right? We want to set a line where if the home team is favored by 5 points, they're going to beat that point spread half the time and lose that point spread half the time, right? So we don't really care if we have the Raiders favored by 5, right? We don't really care if they win or lose. We just care that in the long run that the line is set right and that it's well calibrated half the time. That's not a mentality that very many people in politics get, but to me, I thought our 2016 forecast, where we had Clinton favored but Trump with a 30% chance, was our best forecast that we've ever done. Because
you really believe that?
Absolutely, because you would have made a ton of money if you went. You can't actually bet on politics in Nevada, but if you went online and saw odds of Trump at 15%, you would have doubled your money by following 538's guidance and saying, 15% is awfully low and the real odds are 30%, so I'm going to, make myself a lot of money by betting on Trump. He'll still probably lose, but having a 30% odds of something that's priced at 15% is a good bet.
Yeah, I thought it was 28% chance. You said
28.6.
No, now you're rounding up.
I'm rounding up.
Okay,
that's around by a percentage point.
It's true enough. We're already getting some questions, Nate. I'll get them because I think we're gonna get a bunch for you. How is the proliferation of spam and scam calls on mobile phones affected polling? Because people just won't pick up an unknown phone number.
I'm sure that's part of it, right? There are many reasons why people don't answer strangers' phone calls as much, ranging from caller ID to the proliferation of spam calls, to the fact that just social norms have changed, right? We are a little bit less willing, I think very understandably, to kind of volunteer information to a stranger, to the fact that now when a polling outlet calls, it may say, I am with X and Y university or media organization, right? People may have preconceptions about the political views of that organization. So yeah, the fundamental problem is that if you just kind of randomly call people on the phone, maybe 5 or 10% of people will pick up. and complete your survey. And that's not really how it's supposed to be on paper.
Exactly. It's interesting. When I first started out as a Cub political reporter back in 1986, I hate to date myself, but I will, and I knew nothing about polling, and so if I got a polling memo from a campaign, that was enough for me. That's malpractice, by the way, and I think some outlets still do that. And I've learned a lot about polling and making sure you go into the crosstabs and look at the demographics, make sure that it makes sense at least on its face. I'm wondering if you think that 538 and what you've tried to show people with quantitative data and looking at polling, do you think it's nudged people in my business in the direction of looking more closely at polls, looking at data as opposed to letting their biases take over or letting their superficiality in the way that we too often report on politics take over?
No, I think it's nudged things in the right direction for sure. I think it's kind of a slow and ongoing battle. I think there are kind of some trends in journalism now that are pulling against that a little bit in different directions. And there's also kind of the risk of misinterpreting things, right? Because the goal has never been to always have people think, oh, the polls are always right? It's more saying, let's reserve judgment. Let's use the polls as a way to kind of get the general lay of the land and understand that sometimes the 3-point underdog will win in the NBA or the NFL or in a political race, right? And provide additional context and be more, the term objective is a loaded term, and in some ways I kind of agree with critiques of the way that the old notion of media objectivity isn't really adequate today. But at the same time, polling is one of the more objective portions of a news report and is important to do.
What's always frustrated me since I became more savvy about polling is the media's tendency to treat all polls as being equal. If there's a report of a poll, we will done by someone who doesn't know what they're doing, it will be treated with the same kind of headline or attention that a poll that is done by someone that you and I might even agree is an experienced pollster. And it seems like, and it's got that part of trend in journalism to me has gotten worse because there are so many outlets now competing to be first or to have a sensational headline. Someone leads over someone else, big upset looming, whatever, and there's no discernment in the quality of the poll. That really frustrates me as a journalist.
No, I think the general rule is that kind of you get what you pay for, right? So you have a more rigorous poll, and it tends to be more accurate in the long run. There have been more issues, I think, in the past couple of election cycles where there are different theories about why the polling was off in 2016 and 2020, some of which have to do with the movement of highly educated voters toward the Democratic Party because people who are highly educated tend to answer polls more than people without college degrees, for example. In 2020, there are theories that Democrats were more likely to socially distance and stay at home, right? You stay at home in the pandemic, you're really bored. Lots of opportunities to answer a pollster's phone call. Seriously.
True.
Whereas if you're going out and going to the restaurant in the mall, then you wouldn't, and that's a form of bias that pollsters had not really thought about very much. So COVID may have made polling more challenging in some ways. So I think 2022 is, because the polls were, for the most part, pretty good in 2018. 2022 is a big test for the polling industry, right? We will hopefully not be in lockdown again in November 2022. We won't have Trump on the ballot himself. So if Trump, another theory is that Trump had unique appeal to people who are irregular voters, people who might not vote in a midterm, for example, but because of his celebrity, because of his unique appeal, might turn out to vote if they're kind of considered an unlikely voter. In 2022, you probably won't have that as much, right? And so it should be somewhat easier territory for pollsters. And if they have another bad year, then I don't know, then maybe a shift toward saying maybe polling is broken.
Yeah, exactly. Someone asked an interesting question here, and this is I've thought a lot about this over the years. Are polls influencing voter decisions? Are they used by undecided voters as a guide? And that's why I think the danger of journalists, news organizations not taking what they get seriously before they report it, just put it out there. It does influence people. If people think a race is over, maybe they won't vote. If people think a race is really close, they might vote. It can be very damaging. That's damaging to democracy, is it not?
Well, here's what I think. I think media coverage in general influences people's behavior. And I think polling is a subspecies of media coverage. And the question is it kind of better or worse than other things, right? So the time when media coverage and polling matters a lot in particular is during primary elections where you have multiple candidates, right? Maybe you're someone who's a Democrat, a liberal Democrat, and you liked Elizabeth Warren, but you read a headline in the New York Times that her campaign is in disarray. So you're like, okay, well, I'll vote for Bernie or Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden or someone else, right? By the same token, if you see a poll showing Warren has fallen from 18% to 14%, that might kind of reinforce that message, and that's tricky. And that makes the primary process especially tricky. I think it's a bit more stable in general elections. But no, it's tricky. I mean, the media has to be concerned with any type of horse race framing is like, can potentially influence the outcome. It's the same when you're having Democrats try to pass some complicated legislation and they read media coverage of like, I mean, the media is almost like a negotiating partner in a way, right? It's almost kind of a fourth branch of government in a way that I'm not saying it's like necessarily biasing things, but like it's important to kind of have a more mature view of like how the media works and not just saying, oh, it's just kind of standing aside and kind of reporting the lay of the land. I mean, it can definitely influence both public and policy decisions.
Yeah, and my whole point was just what you were saying too, is that we should take what we do much more seriously, and we wish people would be more discerning in the outlets that they choose to follow. If you saw some of our focus groups, that doesn't always happen. But you mentioned complex legislation. Here's a question for you. Does Nate think that the polls that show that a majority of Americans want the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill are right? And if so, why aren't the polls influencing some lawmakers?
I think they're probably right in broad strokes, although it's a little hard to know whether Americans actually kind of know what's in the bill necessarily. When, if there are tax increases, that they mostly on wealthy people, kind of how they would feel about those potentially. It's also weird that as compared to like other parties' previous big items, so when Democrats tried to pass and did ultimately Obamacare in 2019, that was like kind of the central focus of debate that it at least seemed subjectively kind of crossed over into like mainstream society, right? When the GP tried to repeal Obamacare in 2017, same thing, right? This kind of in the world where we have COVID and protest over race and like threats to democracy and everything else, right? Wildfires, it kind of seems like this is flown on the radar a bit. And whenever that's true, then the question is how much are people really informed about this? In general, though, spending large amounts of money on public welfare programs or infrastructure, in general, that's fairly popular if you're kind of focusing on the spending and not kind of what it would cost. But at the same time, I think that parties often tell themselves stories that are a little self-serving about like, well, you must pass this agenda item or else, voters will backlash in the midterms. I mean, sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, right? Passing Obamacare for Democrats, right? I remember watching a speech by Bill Clinton at some conference. He's like, we must pass Obamacare that will ensure that people will trust Democrats. And they did pass Obamacare and Democrats got slaughtered at the next midterm, right? So I think parties should kind of assume that look, the way it works, you get the trifecta, meaning both branches of Congress and the presidency, maybe only once every 10 or 15 years, 10 to 16 years, right? So, take what you can get. Assume you probably lose the midterm sooner rather than later anyway, right? And pass legislation that you think is important for your party's values, right? Which is like not some idealistic statement so much as saying like, parties tend to lose in their first midterm no matter what. And Democrats have such thin numbers that even if they in some ways overperformed some baseline, they have no room to spare, really. And so it's kind of like do what you can when you have power because you're not going to have it for very long. And when we have extremely partisan government, the idea of doing things in a bipartisan basis is not very realistic outside of emergency type of situations.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of your specific feelings on things, and I'm going to do what I'm sure you love to have done, which is read some of your tweets here live at Indyfest. But first, I want to ask you a question, and I don't mean to be like a psychoanalyst here or get too personal, but I'm really interested in the journey that you've taken since 2008, Nate, in the sense that when you first came on the scene and exploded with your perfect record and all, you were like, like America's favorite nerd and all the rest of this stuff, and it was like you are a godlike figure. And then you've seen what's happened is that now you're easily targeted by people on social media platforms, and I'm wondering how that's affected you, if at all, if you think about it at all, if you feel compelled to respond sometimes but not all the time.
I mean, I always thought I'm in a weird position where people liked me for the wrong reasons, which is that Democrats liked me because they thought I was providing some scientific basis for why Democrats would win. So I was allowing Democrats to like confirm their biases,
right,
under some kind of aura of math and statistics, right? But it was just kind of a coincidence that, in 2008 and 2012, you had Democrats that led in the polls and were ahead maybe by more than conventional wisdom realized and kind of wound up winning, right? In 2016, kind of, again, during that election campaign, we were actually spending a lot of time saying, no, Trump does have a chance, actually. He's not the favorite, Clinton's ahead, but not by very much, and like it's a pretty volatile race, and so people didn't like that as much, right?
Yeah, you kept saying it's not impossible that he wins.
Well, I mean,
you
people,
had caveats. You thought Hillary was
like
the favorite.
I mean, a 30% chance is like that is, that's a three-pointer in the NBA or something, right? Or
right.
a good, so it wasn't even like a remote chance. It's a pretty decent chance. It's a flush draw coming in. But no, I think people so for every one person who like actually understands the method behind it, there are 9 people who are just partisans who have a convenient relationship with me or 538 where, where if I happen to be on their side, they like it. If I'm not, they don't. But I can't really give too much of a fuck about it because like I'm true to myself, right? I don't pander to like what my audience wants to hear, that
Definitely.
90%, maybe the 10% who I actually care about, right?
Right.
And so if they don't like me, then, they don't have to like read 538.
It seems to me, though, and at least publicly, I'm sure privately you're always this way, but publicly you've become more opinionated, for instance, on Twitter than you used to be. Is that through more confidence in your opinions, or you think that's what social media should be used for?
I don't think it's true. I think if you kind of look at my social media, I think Twitter is a medium where it's dominated by a certain type of like college-educated liberal. And so they're very happy to have you be opinionated if you agree with their opinion, right?
Yeah.
If you are pushing back against their prevailing view, then all of a sudden you're opinionated, right? So I don't really think my approach has changed very much on social media at all. I mean, I've always been kind of very, very direct. If you go kind of look at, read my Twitter feed or the 538 blog from 2008 or 2009, right? It's, it's from the blog era. It's always been honest and kind of unvarnished and snarky. And I've never been somebody who really kind of belongs to a political tribe, right? And so it's always been like a little bit sharp-elbowed, and people like that when they like the message, and they don't like that when they don't like the message. But you can't you can't let yourself like care too much about like kind of what people on social media think, because it's not representative of like what normal people think if you talk to people in real life, and B, like it really, algorithmically or whatever, it kind of literally kind of incentivizes like bringing out the worst in people. I think Twitter in particular, right? It's a platform where kind of the notion of like hanging back and being more analytical, right? Being more nuanced and being more subtle, right, is not particularly rewarded, right? It's become more kind of like a platform for like signaling and kind of telling people kind of which team you're on. And so people who are, I think, a bit more heterodox in their approach to life tend to be piled upon on Twitter. Ironically, some of those same people are now achieving a lot of success in other platforms, on podcasts, for example, or on newsletters and stuff like that, right?
Substack,
for example.
Yeah.
But yeah, but Twitter in particular, I think is I don't know. brings out things that I really dislike about American politics and about people, frankly.
No, it's very true. I mean, Twitter can be very useful, especially for journalists and for someone like me. But it can be a real sewer.
It is very useful as a way of like aggregating information, right? If you're following politics, following sports, following the latest COVID data, right? I use Twitter for poker tournaments, right? And follow poker players and stuff like that. And so it's very useful as a kind of one-way device. But to engage with people, the kind of flattening effect. I mean, the other thing that actually causes is like decontextualization. Someone can take any 140 character or 280 character snippet that you said, right, and completely remove it from context. And so it kind of, there's a saying that like it takes 10 times as long to refute bullshit as to create bullshit. On Twitter, the ratio is like 100 to 1 or something, right?
That's right.
It's because you can like literally screenshot a tweet or dunk on a tweet, right? I forget what the official term is, right?
Yes, exactly.
There are more and more ways to do it now, and you might not realize that this is part of a longer argument that was made some number of months ago, and that is actually pretty nuanced and subtle, right? But it's kind of an environment where people will kind of find whatever they can to like draw the caricature of you that they want. But the good thing about it is that normal people know that and don't really care.
Yeah. So I want to talk about COVID and data and how the media has covered COVID, because I know you're very interested in that subject. One thing I noticed as I was looking around for this chat is that there's a line that's in your in your Twitter bio that I hadn't seen there. And I haven't looked at your Twitter bio a lot. I'm not an obsessive Nate Silver Twitter looker, but not a virologist.
Yeah.
You put that on there for some reason, because you're a funny guy. I know you're a funny guy, but is that there's wry humor. It was like to tell people I am not a scientist when I'm talking about COVID. I'm not doing it because I'm a scientist.
Yeah, it's kind of sarcastic, but like the thing about COVID is like, when we were making political decisions about COVID, those are political decisions, right? To me, it's kind of absurd that if you cover politics, you're supposed to have all these opinions about the budget deal, you're supposed to have all these opinions about the Israeli peace accord, right? All these opinions about, racial protests or whatever, right? But COVID, let's just kind of leave that aside to the scientists, right? The question of like, should we give booster shots to certain groups of Americans with these benefits and these trade-offs, right? That is a decision for the people to make, for politicians to make, right? You can be informed by science and say, well, here's the benefits of boosters, and here might be the epidemiological downside, right? But I've been kind of dismayed by, this probably maybe does tie into like kind of what we're talking about earlier, where like the auspices of expertise, where a lot of partisan political views have been laundered into COVID policy, right? And people don't think very carefully about kind of what the actual role of experts is necessarily, right? Deciding should the state of Nevada close its casinos, incredibly complicated decision that is in part an epidemiological question, in part an economic question, right? In part kind of a cultural question, right? But that's not a decision for like some epidemiologist to make, right? That's a decision for the governor and the mayor to make with input from hopefully the best advisors they have, and with input, I think, from their notion of what their constituents would want, because these are very challenging trade-offs to make. And so with COVID, I think we've seen kind of, the problem of it's also tied to educational partisanship, where, as I was talking about before, it's an issue in polling. More and more, people who are highly educated, who went to good universities, or frankly who work in media are liberals, right? And so if you're having people kind of set public health policy, but 97% of them are liberal Democrats, it's going to be, there are definitely many, many areas where vaccines, for example, where I think their expertise is 100% right, But it's hard for them to separate maybe kind of areas where it is based on the science from areas where it's kind of a partisan political view on things that aren't kind of a scientific question and are more of a political or even economic question. And so I think that's kind of like partly why like I wind up like feuding more with experts, is I have kind of trained myself for many years. When you cover elections, right, you try to really sensitize yourself to partisan arguments, whether in yourself or from others, right? Because you know that, the more accurate my forecasts are, we can debate what accuracy means, like that's more rewarding for me in terms of like career opportunities and whatever else, right? So I have pretty good incentives to actually be accurate.
Right.
Most people just are rooting for the home team. And you get very used over many years to whichever side loses, and 1 out of 2 times you lose the election, right? And that side always makes all the rationalizations they can about why the polls are wrong and why they're not going to lose. You become like very attuned to like hearing partisan arguments from smart people who are skilled at engaging in confirmation bias. And so you don't turn that part of your brain off when you're seeing other types of discussions or other types of arguments, right? When kind of all the experts are of a certain political persuasion, then there's going to be some kind of clash potentially if you're trying to stay away from those tribes, so to speak.
That's absolutely right, I think. Let me show people just some of the things you've said about COVID. And the big thing now, of course, is breakthroughs and the Delta variant and what the damage is. This is what you tweeted on September 8th, Nate. You said, okay, but why are Americans fearful of breakthroughs? I suggest it's largely because of the mixed messages they're hearing from public health officials in the media, which often imply that vaccinated people should behave with a lot, emphasize, of caution rather than, quote, returning to normal. Tell me what you meant by that.
What I mean by that, and I mean, the irony is that kind of hear this in the argument over booster doses, which is people will say, well, we could boost, but boosting isn't necessary because when you have a breakthrough infection, it tends to be very mild. It probably transmits only mediocrely to other people relative to an unvaccinated infection. And so therefore, the goal of vaccines is to reduce severe illness and hospitalizations. The vaccines are still doing that very effectively, and so therefore we don't need booster shots, right?
Right.
Okay, it would also seem to me that if the goal of vaccines is to reduce those things and they're doing it effectively, then we should probably try to go and have some semblance of normalcy. Because I think having normal lives are very important, right? And this is kind of one of those things where anytime you get out of the political bubble, every person I know, my friends are by no means normal, right? My friends are kind of eccentric in their own way. But anyone with any kind of common sense understands that we have to kind of get back to our lives, right? We can't isolate ourselves. We can't not see our friends. We can't not send our children to school, right? But you can say things on Twitter that to 75% of Americans is just absolute common sense. And because Twitter is not a very representative platform, and because people who agree with you kind of email you offline and be like, well, Nate, I'm happy that you kind of say these things that seem totally make sense to me, right? But that people seem to get a lot of crap when they say it. But yeah, if you reduce the risk of severe disease by 90% to the point where, and this is not me talking as epidemiologists will say this, right? What the vaccines do is turn COVID into the flu. You can get sick, right? I mean, a breakthrough infection is not necessarily pleasant. A few people will get even severely sick, but they turn it into the flu roughly, which it was not before. The notion that, COVID's just a flu, that's total misinformation, right? But when you cut the rates of severe illness by 90%, mathematically, you get pretty close to kind of what the actual severe outcomes from flu might be. So how does people respond in response to the flu? Well, maybe we should be doing a little bit more mask wearing, even if COVID were somehow to go away. Maybe we should be doing a bit more mask wearing in flu season, right? Be a bit more cognizant of that. Maybe we should definitely be more cognizant of if you feel sick, you should stay home, right? I mean, I kind of remember in the pre-COVID era, you would be out at someone's birthday party, you'd be like, oh, I'm sick, haha, but I decided to come out anyway. Hopefully I'm not contagious, right? Yeah. Or at the office, someone would be in a meeting and say that kind of thing, right? And that probably is something that would be good for us to change. But we don't do because the flu has kind of shut down all of society. We don't kind of shut down schools for extended periods of time, sometimes for very brief periods of time. And we don't kind of reorient our whole lives thinking only about the flu, right? And so I think people are pretty irrational about COVID, not necessarily because they're risk averse, but in part because of like poor media coverage. If you look at so Gallup did a poll recently where they asked kind of people, how many people do you think of the people who get COVID, and they broke it down between vaccinated and unvaccinated people, what percent do you think go to the hospital, right? And the average Democrat thinks that something like 30% of people who get COVID go to the hospital, when the actual number is probably 1 or 2% based on the best epidemiological research, right? Listen, if I thought that COVID was 30 times more dangerous than it actually is, I would never leave my house, right? But if you actually have kind of a proper assessment of what the actual best scientific evidence says, then it would lead you to different conclusions.
Seems to me that it even goes beyond what you said in terms of the mixed messages, that what's really dangerous about COVID is that there's a confluence of things. There's the heavily polarized partisanship that really is going on now. You have a lack of faith in institutions that is really hurting here. And then you have, well, guys in my business like to talk about process too much, you probably think, or style too much. This is one issue where communication and style by people who matter, meaning governors, presidents, is really important, Nate, because that contributes to all of it. I have been critical of the governor here, his communication, some of the decisions, even though I think the decisions were right. So you should say, oh, John, you should be just praiseworthy of the decision. But how you communicate why you're doing something to the public is so important here.
No, I think there's always been a thing where the public health messaging is not willing to deliver complicated messages to people, right? It's dumbed down and oversimplified, right? And so you'll kind of see the message on the one hand and kind of say, okay, actually, I'm talking to scientists, or I'm reading scientific journals, or engaging them on Twitter, right? Or talking to them offline, right? And their view is kind of much more complicated, this kind of public health messaging, but there's a lack of kind of trust with kind of telling people, look, this is going to be a slog to get through. It's going to involve some trade-offs. In the long run, we do need to get back to normal. In the short run, we need to take some precautions, right? And the evidence will change. We are going to have to shift around a little bit with the evidence as best we can, right? And there's kind of been a lack of candor. There's been a lack of, I think one problem that there is in the public health sector is there aren't really communications experts working for the federal health agencies, right? There aren't kind of behavioral experts kind of working for the public health agencies. They kind of wing it. I mean, the irony is I would say they often kind of wing it out of their lane, right? Where if you were able to call on a broader group of experts, people who are psychologists, who are economists, right? People who understand how communities of color might behave differently, right? That would have led to, I think, somewhat more robust public health policy.
You've been very clear, I think, on Twitter, at least I've seen it, on what you really believe at this point in the pandemic. And you correct me if I'm saying any of this wrong. Basically, masks make sense, vaccine mandates are good, schools and businesses should be open. That's at this stage in the pandemic. Are those all data-driven conclusions, or are you just, how did you get there?
I mean, I think they are partly questions of data and partly questions of values, right? I mean, look, my concern, and maybe this is some kind of intuition that isn't yet clear on the data, my concern is that people being physically isolated from one another is going to be very harmful. It's going to be harmful psychologically, it might be harmful to their health, it's going to be harmful to human development, right? And may have kind of grave consequences that we felt for a long time. And there are some evidence of, for example, children who were first in preschool in the pandemic and are in an environment where all adults are wearing masks, is there delays in learning development, right? Child obesity seems to have increased quite a bit potentially. Rates of depression are up quite a bit. Rates of substance use are up quite a bit. Homicides are up quite a bit. Is that because of the pandemic or not? I don't know, right? But so I'm not someone who's ever minimized, I think COVID's a very bad disease. I mean, 700,000 Americans have died. That's absolutely horrifying, right? But the costs of not having society function, the cost of isolating yourself, I think is also very scary and might even lead to kind of, further erosion in our democracy. Everyone's kind of sitting on the internet, kind of in their bubble and not kind of interacting. Like, I think that could contribute to more risk of authoritarianism in society, right? So it's trying to, like, is it data driven? I think in a way it's part of a process of, like, if you are someone who's trained as I am, then you're always looking at costs and benefits, right? And it's always very manipulative to say, okay, well, X and Y policy is unacceptable, therefore we can't do it. Well, the problem is we're, like, deciding between, like, mutually unacceptable outcomes, right? Ordinarily, it would be unacceptable to kind of shut down the entire Las Vegas Strip for 3 months, right? Or to say kids are going to spend an entire year and a half in virtual school. And so you have to kind of wrestle with these uncomfortable questions that ultimately do involve kind of, judgments about kind of how people trade off health outcomes versus other types of health outcomes, or health outcome versus quality of life, or the economy versus health outcomes, right? Those are decisions that in every other kind of realm of life that we make all the time, right? There's a certain speed limit on I-5 or whatever, right? And we can debate whether it should be higher or lower, but it involves a trade-off. There's not a speed limit of 25 miles an hour on the freeway, and there's not a speed limit of infinity, You have to kind of have these discussions, and I think because I don't know, I think I'm willing to kind of say things that other people aren't, because, like, I don't know how to put it. I can afford to without it ruining my livelihood. I don't have to pander to people. If I were told today that I could never ever cover politics again, I might actually be marginally happy about that.
Yeah,
I'm not kidding. I just go play poker or something, right?
That's right.
So, like, I don't really give a fuck if, like, I piss people off that I don't care about.
I get that. So I want to talk about a couple other things before we talk maybe a little bit about more fun stuff like sports. What's going on in D.C. now? Let me just go over a couple things that you tweeted this past week that I thought were interesting, and it does bear repeating. You say, I guess it's boring to talk about this, but people tend to underrate Dems' degree of difficulty. You're talking about getting this passed. When the Senate conveys such a large advantage to rural voters, and one party does much better with those voters, the other party is going to have trouble having a functional majority, meaning Republicans, rural voters, Democrats, and having a functional majority now. That's not going to change, is it?
No, I mean, if you kind of equally weight every state in the Senate, every state gets 2 senators, whether it's California or Wyoming or whatnot, right? That produces very profound skews relative to kind of what the population as a whole looks like. It significantly overweights rural areas. It significantly overweights the white vote relative to non-white votes. And, like, people in the Senate is kind of really the most important institution in the U.S., given its power to, over the Supreme Court, for example, the most important veto point in American politics. And so you can't, like, kind of talk about politics without kind of realizing how important that is. And people kind of treat it as a rounding error. Well, okay, I'm sure it helps the Republicans a little bit, or helps kind of rural white voters a little bit. It's very significant. If you kind of go through and kind of calculate, what if the Senate were equally weighted by population? The Democrats would have approximately 56 senators instead of 50, right? If you have 56 senators and you have the Green New Deal probably, right? You expand the Supreme Court and you add, DC and Puerto Rico and the Northern Marianas Islands or whatever as different states, right? And it would just be a very, very different environment to a degree that, like, we might, by the way, have a 5-4 liberal majority in the Supreme Court right now, not a 6-3 conservative one. Right. And people, like, I think, are just not aware of kind of how important that is, and also in some sense how lucky Democrats are to have even 50 senators, right? They were quite fortunate to win those 2 races in Georgia in January.
Right.
They were fortunate to win in New Hampshire, maybe Nevada in 2016 potentially. They also lost some close ones for sure, like Florida in 2018, for example. But given how much there is this bias toward rural voters in the Senate, and given how much Democrats are now a party of urban voters, it's going to be very hard for the Democrats to maintain even 50 senators, right? Now, things do change, right? Things will shift in in ways that are probably hard to predict right now. So these are more things that might apply to, like, the next 10 years and 20 years out than who the heck knows, right? But it is a very significant effect on American politics, and the fact that Democrats have such slim margins. It seems to me, there was some New York Times article about how, Joe Biden is kind of siding with the liberals, and isn't that risky these days, right? And it's like, really the issue is that you have two people, Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, who have veto power over the entire party's agenda, and they're the pivot points, right? They have this incredible amount of power because Democrats have 50 seats and not 56 or even 53 or 52. And when that's the case, then that constrains strategy a lot. It's kind of not so much about kind of are we passing a more liberal policy or a more conservative one, but about like, how can I mind meld Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema to do what I want for my agenda? And that's a much trickier problem and kind of in some ways less of a kind of classical problem of governance and more of a kind of personal wheeling and dealing issue.
It's interesting you mentioned Sinema, and in that same thread you said this. I think Sinema is pretty irrational. She's greatly increased her chance of losing a primary challenge, and I don't know that she's helped her general election chances one bit. But one problem with a 50-50 quote majority is that one irrational actor can foil all your plans. Now, the math is obviously right there, Nate, but isn't another way to look at it that she's being principled, that she doesn't care whether she gets reelected or not, or gets a primary challenge? So why is that irrational?
First of all, I think most politicians do care a lot about reelection, and empirically, if you kind of assume that politicians care about reelection, then you'll do pretty well for yourself, right? Second of all, I don't think she's really articulated a particularly clear or consistent set of views. I don't think she's necessarily articulated a way in which her views are more consistent with her constituents' views. At least Joe Manchin can say, yeah, there are some Democratic polling firms that say this stuff is popular in my state, but Trump did win by 38 points or whatever, right? There's got to be some limit to this. At least Joe Manchin can kind of say, I'm trying to somehow balance what I think is right against what my constituents think are right versus my party. I'm not sure that that her views are necessarily so coherent. And there's like a lot of media coverage that's like, oh, this person's a maverick, right? She must have incredibly robust. It's like, I don't know. I tend to assume that like people aren't that rational necessarily, right? And you shouldn't necessarily try to find some more profound reason behind things. People can be very driven by impulse and driven by the fact that, some people, maybe I'm like this a little bit, right? If you have people kind of telling you off, maybe kind of rebel against that in the opposite direction. Part of me thinks that every time like Kirsten Sinema reads a tweet by some kind of liberal, right, that's dunking on her, she's like, well, fuck you,
Yeah.
I have the power here and you don't, right? And so, I think I'm just trying to be realistic about the fact that I think she's in the bottom line, you probably can estimate kind of what her reelection chances is. She's, I think, almost for sure going to get a pretty vigorous primary challenge. Maybe she'll survive it, maybe not. But in general, a politician would not want to invite that unless it's a necessary step in a very red state, for example, to fighting off or to preserving your general election chances.
So we've got a couple of questions here, and it's okay if you don't have thoughts on this, but I'd love to hear them if you do. If Nate has thoughts on the upcoming 2022 Nevada Senate and governor races.
I mean, here we are, we're in an environment where we have a lack of polling, right? I guess you're having polling come out tomorrow.
Yes.
And maybe you know that polling and can't tease it, right?
I can't.
Okay.
I do know, but can't tease that much. But I guess this goes to, maybe I'll just add on to the question this way, Nate, in terms of, is there something about October of 2021, trying to predict a year in advance what might happen that's different than October 2019 or October 2017, trying to predict this far in advance? It's very difficult. My experience tells me it's just very difficult.
It's very difficult. Maybe midterms lock in, if anything, a little bit later, because voters aren't as interested in midterms as the presidential election. They don't engage until maybe August or September of the election year. We're also in an issue environment where, the single best thing that will help Joe Biden and Democrats in 2022 is if we are done with the Delta variant and this conference next year is in person, right? People aren't wearing masks in casinos anymore, right? And people also aren't dying of COVID, right? If we can really suppress the virus, then that's going to be the most important thing to any incumbent hoping to get reelected. And that's very unknown. I mean, I think, I'm not going to predict whether the Lambda variant or whatever else, or kind of how long immunity will last or whatever else, right? Or how society will change. But that factor alone, I think, makes it particularly hard to know what's going to happen in a year. And also, by the way, the fact that the fact that there are these Republican challenges to voting rights and really to potentially respecting the results of elections, I think people can't be too both sides about that. That's also pretty unprecedented.
It is.
Both in terms of what happens after next November and November 2024, maybe more markedly, but also in terms of how that affects how voters think. In the one election you had where voters were told that, hey, maybe your vote won't count, the Georgia runoff in 2020, GOP turnout declined quite a bit. So that's another kind of unpredictable factor potentially.
Yeah, and that cost the Republicans in those races probably. Right?
I think for sure. I mean, I think it's kind of at the margin.
Yeah.
But it can go both ways, right? If there are Democrats who think your vote's going to be suppressed, I mean, in the short run, what happens is people will maybe make more of a point of voting, but in the long run, kind of brings up kind of barriers to access, and you see voting as something that becomes more cumbersome, and it can potentially have pretty big effects, and so that's kind of part of the equation.
So this is an interesting question. Does Nate think risk reward is innate to human beings, or can it be taught? Most of us have a skewed understanding of risk.
I mean, if you go out and play, 5-10 limit hold'em at the Bellagio, or no limit hold'em at the Bellagio, right? You'll see people have all types of different views of risk and reward. No, what I think is weird is I think people actually intuitively must have some notion of risk and reward, right? Because things that we kind of do on a routine basis, when you're deciding kind of when to cross the street, whether in a car or yourself, right? You're kind of looking at oncoming traffic, and you're kind of, you're not going to sit there until you can see no cars on the horizon, right? You have some empirical notion that's kind of practiced over a lot of time about how much risk should I undertake. The problem is kind of when you deal with things that are new and irregular, then maybe you don't have those instincts built in, right? For me, I can go play poker because I played poker now for 20 years, right? And see a certain set of cards and say, okay, here's kind of what roughly the odds are, and it won't be exact, but it'll be pretty good because it's practiced, right? For the average person, they probably couldn't, and they'd be terrified if they never played poker before. In the same way, because COVID is so new for everybody, I guess there are a few people alive who might remember 1919 pandemic, but not very many. We don't have very good instincts, which means you have to be more kind of explicit about it. You have to actually explicitly go through and say, here is kind of how we tend to value different things as a society in different contexts. And given those principles, how might that apply to COVID policy, just like setting a speed limit or something? And you have to be more explicit, and even though people it's kind of often seems very uncouth to say things like, well, to some extent, you have to trade off, length of life and quality of life. And those are all things that we intuitively do all the time, right? You will take your kids swimming, even though there are actually a fair number of drowning deaths every year, right? You will maybe engage in eating fatty food and drinking alcohol, right? Because you enjoy those things, even though they probably aren't good for you in terms of preserving kind of the length of your life to some maximal extent. So we do these things all the time. Some people are not very effective at them. Some people are better, right? But we have to have these conversations, and when people kind of try to shut down the conversations, then it's often a sign of partisanship potentially. Anytime someone says we can't do a cost-benefit analysis, my kind of head explodes pretty much.
Your head would explode at that. Let me ask you one other political question, and then maybe we'll wrap it up with a sports discussion, Nate. Something you tweeted last month fascinated me because it's something I've been thinking about in Nevada in governor's races. It probably won't be Andrew Yang, but an unpopular Biden or an unpopular Harris running against Trump in 2024 would be relatively fruitful territory for a third-party presidential bid. One of the things that this conference is wrapped around is this growing cohort of independent, non-major party voters. And I've often thought now with the polarization, with primaries the way that they are, that there may be room for an independent candidate here based on the makeup of the electorate. Much different, of course, running nationally for president, electoral college, ballot access, all the rest of it. But it seems to me now maybe it's not completely out of the question.
I mean, it's one of those things where, look, I think in some ways, I mean, it's always true that if you kind of extend the trajectory out to the infinite period, then it's always unsustainable, right? But in some ways, on the one hand, you have greater and greater partisanship. On the other hand, you have lower and lower regard for the actual parties, a little bit contradictory, right?
Right.
People are unhappy with the state of the country. I mean, there are a lot of ways that could resolve itself. And I think one way, maybe not the most likely way, would be that you eventually do have some type of like third party movement, or even whether it's just independent candidates running for certain offices in certain states. This has clearly not happened yet. I mean, do we have any independent governors in the U.S. right now? I don't think.
I don't think so.
There are two kind of quasi-independent senators who are effectively are Democrats, right? So you couldn't really point to like any growth. There was not very much third-party vote in 2020. But it is a bit nonlinear, by which I mean that if you were someone who liked Gary Johnson, for example, in 2016, I think he did relatively well in Nevada, right? But he's at 6%, and you have an opinion about Trump versus Clinton, then you're kind of throwing your vote away, right? In theory, I mean, I don't know, right? And because in theory, Joe Biden's approval ratings have worsened to the point where they're now net negative already. Although it's often true for a president at this point in his term, right? Trump has not really become any more popular. Now, the counter-argument to this is that there is not some group of centrist voters just sitting around. There are some centrists, but there are also some people who are eccentric, who might be economically liberal and socially conservative, or vice versa, right? Or there might be people who say, well, I'm not a Democrat because they're too liberal or too far right from me, right? Some Bernie voter, for example, or some Republican who says, or some conservative says, Republicans are establishment sellouts, right? I'm a Trumpist instead. So the fact that you have so many people identify as independent, is that the same thing as people kind of wanting a particular third-party candidate that they could all agree on? I just think that is it a 1 in 20 chance? Maybe, right?
Yeah.
And I would take 20-1 odds on a third-party candidate winning, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. So let's talk sports for just a few minutes. So we only have a few minutes left, Nate. I see the cap you're wearing.
Yeah.
Here's something you don't know about me. I started following baseball when I was 9 years old, which was in 1968. So what team do you think I'm a fan of, Nate?
The Tigers?
Mickey Lolich,
Yeah.
Denny McLain. Yeah, the Tigers. Can you believe it?
I can believe it. I mean, yeah. I was 6 years old in 1984. I lived in Michigan, so I probably become a Tigers fan anyway. But that was one of the, I think one of the 10 or 20 best major league teams of all time.
35-5 they started.
35-5.
Yeah.
Alan Trammell.
Yeah.
Jack Morris, right?
Jack Morris, yeah.
So really a fun team. Yeah.
So let me ask you before we get to the obvious questions about Vegas. I saw the recent 538 ratings on the NFL. Do my Bills have a chance to win the Super Bowl?
Sure. Yeah. No, of course.
Keep hope alive despite the 4 in a row that still are seared into my past, Nate?
I mean, that's just random chance, right? It's like at the roulette wheel, right? They'll show you, Reds come out 4 times in a row. It's trying to trick you. The Bills, I think there's no institutional memory of.
It's hard to lose 4 Super Bowls in a row, Nate.
It's hard to make 4 Super Bowls in a row, though.
That's
so it's
true.
quite an accomplishment.
That's true. But the truth about that is that they only really should have won the first one when Norwood missed the field goal and Parcells outcoached Marv Levy. As you remember back then, the NFC was dominant, and they had no chance in those other 3 games.
Yeah, I mean, the first one was stung a little bit, right?
But a little bit. Yeah, but they have a chance, don't they? Just 12-5, I think you have them projected at.
I have 3 fantasy football teams. Josh Allen's the quarterback for all 3.
Is that right? Yeah. I was not a believer in Josh Allen. Now I am. So I never thought that Las Vegas would have 1 major league franchise and much less 2 major sports franchises. First of all, let's start with the Raiders. They're off to a great start. Derek Carr is throwing for 400 yards a game. It's crazy. I think Derek Carr's the real deal. I can't bring myself to be a super Raiders fan yet. I'm going to go to a game for the first time a little later this year. I'm excited about it. But and if the Bills came here, I would root for the Bills. I'm sorry, everybody who's who's watching. But are the Raiders any good?
I should look at what 538 says about. I mean, I think they're probably a 500 team.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
Yeah.
And so this is going to all probably collapse on them, right?
I mean, but in a 16 or now 17, game season, right? You can go again. I'm so thrown off by 17 versus 16. You can go.
Yeah, I'm thrown off too by that. Yeah.
11-6 now,
Yeah.
or make the playoffs, and for sure, even if you are a 500 team, there is when you have a dominant team, as we talked about, it's hard, right? But like week to week in the NFL, there's a lot of variation.
What about the Knights? They're a real phenomenon here. Hockey in the desert, Nate.
Yeah, no,
You've been to
skeptical.
games, right?
I've been to a couple games. Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember I got in a big argument with the poker player Daniel Negreanu.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's not really, because I grew up going to hockey games, Michigan State University hockey games, right? You watch the Red Wings and win a bunch of Stanley Cups. And I'm like, hockey's a very regional sport, right? It's a big four sport in the Northeast and the upper Midwest and Canada. It's the sport, right? But like, it doesn't really work outside of those regions unless you have like a ton of people like in LA, right? I couldn't have been more pleasantly surprised by the couple of Knights games I've been to, like how passionate fans are, how much hockey knowledge fans are, and like it's not tourists from the Strip. It's like kind of people who have like been looking for a long time for some kind of source, I think, of civic pride. And of course, the team is also very good, right? But no, those Knights games are really fun. Although I did go I went in June. It was like the first game of their series against the Canadiens. It was like I think the first sporting event in North America to have no vaccine requirement, no masks, and full capacity. And I'm like, I think there's going to be another wave.
Yeah,
of COVID.
That's an uncomfortable feeling, right?
Yeah, it's like we're going back to normal like a little bit too fast here. But it is a tremendous venue, and the team's been really well run, and I mean the NBA has realized this for a long time, right? That like you have a team in Oklahoma City or a team in Portland or Sacramento or Memphis, right? Vegas is on a bigger scale than that. I think the leagues, if anything, have been too slow to expand here. I mean, it is also said it's like, although because of, it's cyclical city, but it's growing pretty fast, right? And people kind of have this outdated view of Las Vegas in some ways. I mean, I come here a lot because I play in poker tournaments, or I go give talks at conferences that are held here, right? But like I spend a lot of time here relative to a lot of places, and Vegas in 2021 is a lot different and more robust as a city than when I first probably played my first World Series of Poker in 2006 or whatever, right? It's really kind of filled in a lot. It reminds me a lot of when I used to be a kid in the 80s going to Los Angeles, California, actually, right? See, my grandparents lived in the San Fernando Valley, right? It was becoming more and more diverse, and you'd have like kind of different ethnic communities propping up, and you kind of saw society like kind of literally kind of filling in, right? And you kind of, when I came here for the caucuses 2 years ago now, it was kind of the first time I kind of was here and actually was spending a lot of time off the Strip. And I don't know, I think I am very optimistic about the kind of long-term future of Las Vegas.
Do you have a house here yet, Nate?
No, I don't. No, but I have friends who are thinking about moving here, and I think kind of, you see places like Austin and Miami doing well, and I think in some ways Nevada is kind of similar, right? Where you have maybe often too warm, but the weather is nice for some months out of the year, right? You have a workforce that offers different kind of cultural amenities and stuff like that, and you have kind of relatively cheap cost of living. We can debate how good the governance is in the state. We could understand if you are kind of more of an independent or a moderate, why you might prefer it to, say, California or something. So it wouldn't surprise me if you kind of begin to see this kind of seen as a destination for tech companies and so forth as well.
Real quickly, what's in your future? Are you happy with what you're doing now? You're going to take on something new? What's going on?
So I'm working on a book about gambling and risk, which is part of why I'm actually here for most of the next month. It's part of why I kind of am like thinking about like how people process risk under COVID and whatnot. So that's kind of my next big project. Hopefully I will still have plenty of time to cover next year's midterms, which I think should be totally fascinating. But yeah, I mean, I have always tried to approach politics from the point of view of like someone who has an unusual background, right? I was like an economics major in college. I worked for a consulting firm, then I built models to forecast baseball. I played poker, right? So like I don't kind of come from like a traditional kind of reporting background.
Right.
Although kind of your type of reporting background is now, I think, again, like quite different than the background that people who work in elite media have now, right? I think much to the benefit of your generation of journalists, actually, in a lot of ways, right? Where you are kind of growing up in a community, and like I don't know. I think one thing that like kind of helps me, even if you hate some of my takes on Twitter, right? I think it helps me the fact that I have like a lot of friends who are not in politics or media. Most of them aren't. And so you kind of actually kind of hear, and they are mostly college educated and so forth, right? So they are elites in some sense, but like, but it's good to like actually kind of have kind of not be in your, I'm in my own bubble, but not the same bubble as other people.
You know, it's been an absolute pleasure to sit down and chat with you for about an hour. Nate, I really appreciate your coming to Indyfest, and I wish you the best of luck at the tables during the next month and the book. Good luck.
Cool. Thank you so much, John.
You bet. And thanks to everybody who stuck around for all day for Indyfest. We'll be back tomorrow. You don't have to get up as early. Well, as I mentioned, we're going to have the transportation secretary right at lunchtime, right at noon. Pete Buttigieg will be here by Zoom, as will Mark Mellman later, to talk about our poll. And our poll results will be the big deal tomorrow, talking about who's winning the governor's race in the Republican primary and how Steve Sisolak's doing against the Republican candidates, and also Adam Laxalt and Catherine Cortez Masto. What does that look like? We're going to release the full poll tomorrow. And finally, we'll wrap it up with an online gaming panel with two of the leaders in the country, the head of MGM Resorts and Bill Miller from the American Gaming Association. Thanks for attending Indyfest. We'll see you tomorrow.